It was a warm and peaceful afternoon. The sun shone gently over the meadow beside the river, while a soft breeze moved through the trees. A young girl named Alice sat beside her sister. Her sister was reading a book, but Alice was feeling very bored. She looked at the sky. She looked at the river. She watched butterflies dancing among the flowers, yet nothing seemed exciting. Alice sighed softly. "I wish something interesting would happen," she thought. At that very moment, something extraordinary appeared. A white rabbit wearing a red waistcoat hurried across the grass. But the strangest thing was that the rabbit was carrying a golden pocket watch. The rabbit looked at the watch nervously and exclaimed, oh dear, I shall be late." Alice's eyes grew wide with surprise. She had never seen a rabbit wearing clothes or carrying a watch. Her curiosity awakened immediately. Without hesitation, she jumped to her feet and followed the rabbit. The rabbit ran through the bushes, past several trees, and suddenly rushed toward a large hole beneath an old oak tree. Alice followed close behind. But just as she reached the hole, the rabbit disappeared. Alice leaned forward and looked inside. The hole seemed very deep. For a moment, she hesitated, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. And in the very next instant, Alice jumped down the rabbit hole. Alice expected to reach the bottom of the rabbit hole almost immediately, but that did not happen. She kept falling and falling and falling. The hole was so deep that it seemed endless. At first, Alice felt nervous, but soon she realized that she was drifting downward very slowly enough to look around. The walls of the rabbit hole were quite unusual. Bookshelves lined the sides of the tunnel. Some shelves were filled with old books. Others held maps, picture frames, and curious objects. As she drifted past one shelf, Alice picked up a jar. The label read, "Orange Marmalade." Unfortunately, the jar was empty. Alice thought to herself, if I drop it, it might hurt someone below. So she carefully placed it on another shelf as she continued falling. With plenty of time to think, Alice began wondering where she was going. "Perhaps I'm falling all the way to the center of the earth," she said. The idea seemed fascinating. She tried to remember what she had learned in school about the world beneath her feet, but she could not make much sense of it. As time passed, the air grew cooler. Still, the rabbit hole continued downward. Alice yawned. She began to feel sleepy. Soon, she imagined telling the story of her adventure to her beloved cat, Dinah. Smiling softly, she whispered. Dinah would never believe this. Her eyes slowly began to close. Then suddenly, the fall came to an end. Alice landed gently on a pile of soft, dry leaves. She was completely unharmed. Quickly, she stood up and looked around. In the distance, she spotted the white rabbit hurrying down a dark corridor. "Wait!" Alice called, but the rabbit did not hear her. A moment later, he disappeared around a corner. Alice took a deep breath. Her adventure had only just begun.
Alice hurried down the long corridor, following the white rabbit, but the farther she went, the less she could see of him. At last, the corridor opened into a magnificent hall. Alice stopped and stared in amazement. The ceiling was high above her. Bright lamps hung overhead, filling the room with warm, golden light. But the most remarkable thing was the number of doors. Doors were everywhere. Large doors, small doors, narrow doors, round doors, doors of every shape and color imaginable. Alice walked to the nearest door and turned the handle. Locked. She tried another. Locked again. One by one, she tested every door in the hall. None of them would open. Alice sighed. She had no idea what to do next. Then she noticed something she had not seen before. In the center of the hall stood a small glass table with 3 delicate legs. On top of the table rested a single object, a tiny golden key. Alice's eyes sparkled with excitement. She picked up the key and hurried from door to door. Most of the locks were either too large or too small. But in a quiet corner of the hall, she discovered a tiny door she had not noticed before. It was very small. Alice knelt beside it and carefully inserted the golden key. Click. The lock opened. Her heart raced. Slowly she pulled the door open and peeked inside. What she saw took her breath away. Beyond the doorway was a beautiful, magical garden. Colorful flowers glowed beneath the sunshine. Small fountains sparkled among winding paths. bright birds fluttered between the trees. Everything looked more beautiful than anything Alice had ever seen. "I must get into that garden!" she exclaimed. But then she realized there was a problem. The door was far too small, and she was far too large. She could not even fit her head through the opening. Alice felt disappointed. The garden was right there, just beyond her reach. Yet she had no way to enter. Slowly she closed the little door and looked around the hall. Surely there had to be a solution. Wonderland was waiting for her, and Alice was not ready to give up. Alice sat beside the tiny door and gazed at the beautiful garden beyond it. The garden was so close that she could see the colorful flowers clearly. Yet, it remained completely out of reach. Alice sighed. Surely there had to be a way inside. She stood up and looked around the hall once more. Then something caught her attention. A small bottle stood on the glass table. Alice was certain it had not been there before. The bottle was clear, filled with a sparkling liquid. Attached to it was a label that read, "Drink me." Alice picked up the bottle. She was a careful girl, so she examined it closely before doing anything else. "I hope this isn't dangerous," she thought, but there were no warnings on the bottle. Carefully, she took a small sip. The taste was quite extraordinary. It seemed to contain hints of cherry, vanilla, honey, and many other delicious flavors she could not identify. Alice liked it so much that she soon finished the entire bottle. A few moments later, something remarkable happened. Alice felt herself becoming smaller. Smaller. And smaller. And smaller. She looked around in amazement. The doors appeared much larger. The glass table seemed taller than ever. The ceiling looked farther away. Of course, the hall had not changed. Alice had. She had become very small. Now she was exactly the right size to fit through the tiny golden door. Alice clapped her hands with delight. At last, she could enter the garden. Excitedly, she ran toward the door. Then suddenly she stopped. She had forgotten something important. The golden key. It was still resting on top of the glass table. And now the table looked as tall as a tower. Alice tried climbing one of its legs. She tried again and again. But the key remained far beyond her reach. Disappointed, Alice sat down on the floor. The beautiful garden was right there, just beyond the doorway. Yet once again, something stood in her way. Still, Alice was not ready to give up. Wonderland had many more surprises waiting for her. Alice had become very small, small enough to fit through the tiny golden door. But there was still a problem. The golden key remained on top of the glass table. She tried several times to climb the table leg, but she could not reach it. Disappointed, Alice sat down on the floor. It seemed that every time she came close to her goal, something stood in her way. Then she noticed a small box. Inside was a beautiful cake. Written on top in sweet letters were the words, "Eat me." Alice thought for a moment. If this strange place can make me smaller, perhaps it can make me larger too. She took a bite. Moments later, her body began to grow. Larger and larger and larger. Soon her head touched the ceiling. Her hands pressed against the walls. She had become so large that she could barely move. Alice felt helpless. Tears filled her eyes. One tear fell, then another, and another. Before long, her tears formed a great pool across the hall, a shimmering lake made entirely of tears. After some time, Alice became small once again. This time, she was tiny enough to float upon the water. She drifted across the pool of her own tears, unsure of where she was going. Then she noticed she was not alone. Nearby, a small creature was swimming through the water. A mouse. "Hello!" Alice called cheerfully. The mouse looked at her cautiously, and a new adventure was about to begin. Alice and the mouse swam together across the pool of tears. Soon, several other creatures joined them. A duck, a colorful parrot, a small eagle, and a strange bird called the dodo. Everyone was soaking wet. When they finally reached the shore, the animals began discussing how to dry themselves. Each creature had a different idea, but none of the suggestions seemed very helpful. At last, the dodo stepped forward. "I have a solution," he announced. The animals gathered around. "We shall have a race." The creatures looked confused. The dodo drew a large circle on the ground, but there was no starting line, there was no finish line, and there were no rules. Everyone could begin whenever they wanted, and stop whenever they wished. Despite this, all the animals eagerly began running. Some ran in circles, some ran straight ahead, some walked slowly, others constantly changed direction. Alice watched and laughed. It was the strangest race she had ever seen. After a while, the dodo suddenly declared, "The race is over." Everyone stopped. One animal immediately asked, "Who won?" The dodo thought carefully. Then he proudly announced, "Everyone has won." The animals cheered happily, but another question quickly followed. "Who will give the prizes?" All eyes turned toward Alice. Surprised, Alice searched her pockets. At last, she found a few small candies. She shared them with everyone. The animals were delighted. Soon afterward, the creatures went their separate ways. Alice found herself alone once again. Looking into the distance, she noticed a mysterious forest. Taking a deep breath, she began walking toward it. Her adventure was far from over.
Alice walked deeper into the mysterious forest of Wonderland. Tall trees stretched toward the sky. Strange flowers bloomed in brilliant colors. Unknown birds sang among the branches. As Alice followed the winding path, something unusual caught her attention. In a small clearing stood an enormous mushroom. It was taller than Alice herself. Curious, she stepped closer. When she looked up, she noticed a strange figure sitting on top of the mushroom. A large blue caterpillar. The caterpillar sat quietly and calmly. Soft blue smoke drifted around him. For a long moment, he simply stared at Alice. Then he spoke. In a slow and thoughtful voice, he asked, "Who are you?" Alice was surprised. It sounded like a simple question. Yet, suddenly, she found it difficult to answer. "To be honest," she replied, "I'm not quite sure anymore." The caterpillar raised an eyebrow. Alice continued, "I've changed my size so many times today that I don't feel like the same girl I was this morning." The caterpillar remained silent for a moment. Then he said, "Change is not a strange thing." But Alice still felt confused. "How can I control my size?" she asked. The caterpillar pointed toward the mushroom beneath him. "One side will make you grow taller," he explained, "and the other side will make you grow smaller." Alice's eyes widened with surprise. She thanked him. The caterpillar simply gave a small smile, then slowly moved away. Alice broke off a small piece of the mushroom. This new secret might help her in the adventures ahead. And now she was ready to continue her journey through Wonderland. Carrying the pieces of the magical mushroom, Alice continued her journey through Wonderland. The forest was quiet. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. But the farther she walked, the more she felt that someone was watching her. Alice stopped. She looked around carefully. No one was there. Then something unusual caught her attention. High among the branches of a large tree, two glowing eyes appeared. Alice stared in surprise. A moment later, a wide smile appeared beneath them. Yet there was still no face. Slowly, a head began to form. And then ears. Then a body. Soon, a large striped cat was sitting comfortably on a tree branch. The cat wore a mysterious smile. "Hello," Alice said politely. "Hello, Alice," replied the cat. Alice blinked. "How do you know my name?" The cat simply smiled. After a moment, Alice asked, "Could you tell me which way I should go?" The cat thought for a moment. "That depends on where you want to get to." Alice considered the question. "I don't really mind where." The cat chuckled. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go." Alice thought about this carefully. Then she asked, "Who lives around here?" The cat pointed with one paw. "Over there lives the Mad Hatter." Then he pointed in the opposite direction. "And over there lives the March Hare." Alice looked uncertain. "But I don't want to meet crazy people." The Cheshire Cat's smile widened. "Oh, you can't help that," he said. "We're all mad here." Alice was not quite sure what to think. The longer she stayed in Wonderland, the stranger everything became. Finally, she decided to continue her journey. But just as she turned to leave, something remarkable happened. The cat began to disappear. First his tail vanished, then his body, then his head, until only his smile remained. The smile floated in the air for a few moments. Then it disappeared as well. Alice stared in amazement. And then continued down the path toward her next adventure. Alice continued walking along the forest path. After some time, she noticed a strange house among the trees. It was a small house. Its chimneys looked like rabbit ears. Its roof appeared soft and furry. Curious, Alice approached. Outside the house stood a very long table. The table was covered with teacups, teapots, plates, and cakes. But the strangest part was the guests. At one end sat the March Hare. At the other sat the Mad Hatter. Between them, a sleepy dormouse was dozing. As Alice approached, they all shouted, "No room! No room!" Alice looked at the table. There were dozens of empty seats. "There's plenty of room," she replied, and she sat down anyway. The Mad Hatter smiled, then suddenly asked, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" Alice blinked in confusion. She thought carefully, but no answer came to mind. Finally, she admitted, "I don't know." The Hatter laughed. "Neither do I." Alice became even more puzzled. The conversation grew stranger and stranger. Nobody answered questions directly. Everyone seemed to be discussing completely different topics. Meanwhile, the guests constantly changed seats. Every few minutes, they moved one chair along the table, as though the tea party had no rules at all. Alice finally asked, "Why are you always drinking tea?" The Hatter sighed. Then he told a curious story. He explained that time had become angry with him. As a result, the clock had stopped forever at 6 o'clock. Tea time never ended. The more Alice listened, the less she understood. Eventually, she decided she had had enough. Standing up from the table, she looked at the strange gathering and said, "This is the most ridiculous tea party I have ever seen." Then she walked away. Behind her, she could still hear the laughter of the Mad Hatter. After leaving the tea party, Alice continued her journey through Wonderland. Before long, she arrived at a grand gate. Beyond the gate lay a magnificent royal garden. Rose bushes filled the landscape. Stone pathways wound through the flowers. Beautiful fountains sparkled beneath the sunlight. But something unusual caught Alice's attention. 3 gardeners were painting white roses red. Curious, Alice approached them. "Why are you painting the roses?" she asked. One gardener looked nervous. "The roses were supposed to be red," he explained. "But by mistake, we planted white ones." Another gardener whispered anxiously, "If the queen finds out, she'll be furious." Suddenly, the sound of trumpets echoed through the garden. The gardeners froze. "The queen is coming!" one of them cried. Moments later, a grand procession entered the garden. Playing card soldiers marched in neat rows. Behind them came courtiers and attendants. Among them walked the King of Hearts, and beside him strode the Queen of Hearts herself. The queen surveyed the garden. Then she noticed the gardeners. Her expression darkened. "Who did this?" she demanded. The gardeners trembled with fear. Without waiting for an answer, the queen shouted, "Off with their heads!" Alice was shocked, yet something seemed very strange. Nobody appeared eager to carry out the order. The queen continued shouting, "Off with his head! Off with their heads! Off with everyone's head!" But the people simply nodded and carried on. Soon the queen noticed Alice. She stared at her carefully, then asked, "Who are you?" Alice politely introduced herself. The queen studied her for a moment, then suddenly smiled. "Come and join our croquet game." Alice had never seen a croquet game like this before, and she sensed that another adventure was about to begin. Alice followed the Queen of Hearts to the croquet ground. She quickly discovered that this was no ordinary game. The field was uneven. Nothing was arranged properly, and there seemed to be no real rules. When Alice looked at the equipment, she was even more surprised. The mallets were live flamingos. The balls were small hedgehogs. And the hoops were playing card soldiers bent into arches. Alice picked up a flamingo, but it kept moving its head. The hedgehog rolled away before she could hit it. Nobody seemed able to play properly. Players bumped into one another. Flamingos wandered off. Hedgehogs ran in every direction. And the card soldiers grew tired of standing still. Throughout the chaos, the queen repeatedly shouted, "Off with their heads! Off with their heads! Off with their heads!" Whenever something displeased her, she gave the same command. Alice tried her best to remain calm. Then something unusual happened. A familiar smile appeared in the air. Alice recognized it immediately. The Cheshire Cat had returned. First came the smile, then the eyes, then the head. But this time, there was no body. The cat's head floated in midair. Alice was delighted to see him again. She began talking with him. However, when the queen noticed the cat, she became furious. "Off with his head!" she shouted. The soldiers looked confused. One of them finally said, "But Your Majesty, how he only has a head?" Nobody knew how to carry out the order. Meanwhile, the Cheshire Cat simply smiled. Slowly, he began to fade away. A few moments later, only the smile remained. Then it, too, disappeared. Alice looked up and smiled. Wonderland seemed stranger every minute. After the croquet game ended, Alice followed the crowd toward the Queen's palace. Inside, a great hall had been prepared. Rows of seats filled the room. At the far end stood the thrones of the King and Queen of Hearts. But today, the palace felt different. A trial was about to begin. Everyone had gathered to hear the verdict. Curious, Alice found a seat among the spectators. At the front of the courtroom stood a guard holding a golden chain. Beside him stood the accused. It was the Knave of Hearts. His crime was quite unusual. He had been accused of stealing the Queen's tarts. On a nearby table sat a plate of colorful pastries. The Queen raised her voice. "Let the trial begin." The King of Hearts, acting as judge, sat proudly upon his throne. However, it quickly became clear that nobody truly understood how a proper trial should work. Witnesses were called one after another. Yet their testimony made very little sense. One witness talked about tea, another talked about music. A third did not even know why he had been summoned. The more Alice listened, the less she understood. Then suddenly, she heard her own name. Alice! Surprised, she stepped forward. The Queen demanded that she give evidence. But Alice knew nothing about the missing tarts. At that moment, something strange began to happen. Alice started growing again, taller and taller. The chairs looked smaller. The card soldiers no longer seemed frightening. Even the Queen appeared less powerful than before. "Be quiet!" shouted the Queen. But Alice was no longer afraid. With courage, she declared, "This trial makes no sense at all." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone stared at her. For the first time, someone had dared to challenge the queen. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Everyone was staring at Alice. The Queen of Hearts was furious. Her face turned bright red. She rose from her throne and shouted, "Off with her head!" But this time Alice was not afraid. She was no longer the confused little girl who had first entered Wonderland. Looking directly at the Queen, she boldly declared, "You're nothing but a pack of cards." Suddenly, everything changed. The card soldiers leaped into the air. They rushed towards Alice. Cards began flying everywhere. Hundreds of playing cards swirled around her. A powerful wind filled the courtroom. Alice raised her hands to protect her face. More and more cards filled the air. Everything around her began to fade. The courtroom disappeared. The palace disappeared. The king and queen vanished. It was as if Wonderland itself was dissolving. The cards spun faster and faster, flying directly toward Alice. Then suddenly, Alice opened her eyes. She was lying beneath the same tree beside the river. The sun shone gently overhead. A soft breeze moved through the leaves. Her sister sat quietly nearby. Everything felt calm and real. Alice looked around. There was no palace, no Queen of Hearts, no Cheshire Cat. It had all been a dream. But what an extraordinary dream it had been. Alice smiled. She knew she would never forget Wonderland, and perhaps one day she might find her way back again.
Who knows? Maybe Wonderland is waiting for you too. What was your favorite part of Alice's adventure? Never stop dreaming